Okay, I shall certainly do that. So I would just like to say welcome everyone, deacon conveners, ex-deacon conveners, late deacon conveners, collector of the house, late collector, directors of the Grand Antiquity Society, deacons, late deacons and ex-deacons, Sir Geoff, and ladies and gentlemen. As priests of the Grand Antiquity Society, I would like to welcome you to this year's annual lecture, which is titled From Jamaica to Jamaica Street, and will be given by Professor Emeritus Sir Geoff Palmer. So a little bit of background on Sir Geoff. Professor Emeritus Sir Geoff Palmer, CD, OBE, DSc, arrived in London as an immigrant from Jamaica in 1955 to rejoin his mother, who left Jamaica in 1948. After leaving school in London in 1958, he worked and attended evening classes to improve his qualifications. He subsequently entered Leicester, Edinburgh and Heriot-Watt universities, where he gained a BSc, PhD and DSc degrees respectively. Sir Geoff is a board member of various organisations and is patron of the Association of Jamaican Nationals, Birmingham, UK. He has published several books on different subjects and has received various research, academic and community awards. Professor Palmer is an honorary Freeman of Midlothian in Scotland. He gained his OBE in 2003, Charge d'Affaires of Jamaica in 2020, and was knighted in 2014 for his contributions to science, charity, and human rights. For his sins, he's actually also a member of the Maltman and has held the position of visitor. So I would like to welcome you, Sir Geoff, to this evening and ask you if you would very kindly present this year's annual lecture titled Jamaica to Jamaica Street. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And when I listen to all that from what is called my CV, I turn around and I wonder who the devil is it they're talking about. Because I was born in Jamaica. Well, I'll give my age, everybody knows it anyway. I was born in Jamaica in 1940. And I was born in the country, a place called St. Elizabeth. And in St. Elizabeth, you know, I've just realized that there's a very famous school called Monroe College. And there are Scottish connections with Monroe College, but I wasn't well off enough to go to Monroe. I was born there and my mother took me from St. Elizabeth to Kingston, the capital. I think my father was a shoemaker, and therefore there was more business in Kingston than there would be in the country. So we lived in Kingston until 1948. And my father, like a lot of Jamaican men then, just disappeared. In 1948, he went to America to what was called farm working. I think the Americans needed people to pick oranges and fruits in the South. So he went to do that in 1948, but he forgot to come back. And therefore, I never saw him again, interestingly enough, until, that's 1948, I didn't see him again until 1975. And I'll mention that somewhere during my lecture in terms of meeting up with my father again after all those years. However, my mother lived with her sisters, which was quite common then. You know, she's on her own, she goes and lives with her sisters. And in 1951, she decided to come to London, like a lot of the young people were leaving, to try and get some work, because there was no work in Jamaica in 1951. And therefore, she left me with her sisters, and they looked after my education from 1951. Now, what was my education in Jamaica? It was during the colonial times. So, and I was just going to a local school, but it was a church school. And you had to go to church a lot to be in the school. And church was 3 times every Sunday: morning service, Sunday school, and night service. And that's very important, because part of the legacy of colonialism in Jamaica is that, you know, most Jamaicans are Christians. And you'll find that in a lot of the other colonies. And therefore, I had to go to church 3 times every Sunday as a young boy. And you couldn't miss church unless you were sick. And of course, if you were sick, you had to take castor oil. And therefore, I would rather go to church than take castor oil. So what you're having, what I'm telling you is the post-slavery population and the behavior. It was, there was no church during slavery, but post-slavery, post-slavery colonialism, the Caribbean was extremely Christian in its attitudes and behavior. Now, my mother sent my fares for me to come to London in 1955. So she left in 51. In 1955, she sent £86 for me to come to London to join her, because she wanted somebody to help her to work. She was working on her own, and it took her from 1951 to 1955 to save £86. So I'm the product of £86, because I got, just before I left, I've got a grandaunt who lived with us, and she told me to take my shirt off just before I got the plane to New York. I had to take my shirt off, and she wrapped me in newspaper because she didn't quite work out. It was going to take 10 days for me to arrive in London. So she figured it was cold, so she was helping me. And I thought, I used to say to people, that's part of my sense of belonging, because here's my grandaunt looking after me, trying to keep me warm with newspaper. Well, anyway, I kept the newspaper on until I got to New York, because nobody disobeyed her. In fact, she was very fair-skinned in terms of color, and it was her house, but I wished I knew something about her. I had no idea who she was. She just was the boss of the house, and she was my mother's aunt, and she was my grandaunt. However, I arrived in New York. The newspapers were soaking wet. I got on the ship, and then I took the newspaper off. I took up the boat from the Hudson River to Liverpool on my own in 1955. I was just short of 15 years of age. I arrived at Liverpool in March 1955, and I had no idea where I was. I've just traveled 5,000 miles, and I was at Liverpool. So I asked somebody where was Paddington, and they said, you've got to get a train. So I got a ticket, and I took a train to Paddington. And there was my mother standing on the station. I'd not seen her since 1951. I didn't recognize her. Fortunately, she recognized me, and she took me home, gave me something to eat, and we went to bed. She lived in one room in an attic in North London. And the next morning, she woke me up at 6 o'clock. I just traveled 5,000 miles. She woke me up at 6 o'clock, and then she gave me the bad news. She said, you're going to work. No, I'd never heard of work. However, we got dressed, and I had something to eat, and then we were just leaving the house about 7:30. where she lived in. You know, there were many tenants in this one house. And we got to the door, and at the front door, and there was a man there. And he had a briefcase and a three-piece suit. And he said to my mother, "Is that Godfrey Palmer? Because my name isn't Geoff. My real name is Godfrey." And the man said to my mom, "Is that Godfrey Palmer?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Where are you going?" And my mom says, "We're going to work. I've got him a job at the milk shop." The place they used to call it a milk shop. "I've got him a job in a milk shop delivering sandwiches." And the man said, "Well, I'm very sorry, but he's not 15. He's got to go back to school." And that was the immigration officer, which they had then. So had he been 5 minutes late, then I would be at work, you know, if he didn't come back. So anyway, I had to go back to school, although my mother protested because she wanted her £86 back. And that was she always uses that until she sadly passed away in 2003. Whenever she wanted me to do something, no matter what I've ever given her, she says, "I want my £86 back." And that was irredeemable. You couldn't get, you know, I could never pay that, but never mind. She took me to a local school and they rejected me because they said I was educationally subnormal. I'd not been to a formal school, but I could read a bit. So then I had to go to another school, which was a secondary modern. I then went to the secondary modern and I was very good at cricket. And I got transferred to the grammar school because of my cricket, not in terms of my academic abilities. The local grammar school headmaster needed a cricketer. So I went to Highbury County. That was the old Rhodes Boyson School. And I stayed there from 1955 to 1958. I think I got a few O levels and maybe one A level, not very good marks. But anyway, I left in 1958. It was a bit of a struggle. And I got a job at London University as a junior lab technician. And I worked at Queen Elizabeth's College from 1958 until 1961. And the professor there was a very good man. He said to me one day, "I think you've got some abilities and I'm going to give you a half day off." And he gave me a half day off and I got 4 A levels and I got 8 O levels, but nobody at a British university would take me because they took overseas students, not immigrants in those days. So the professor, when I told him, he was rather annoyed, and he phoned up Leicester University. And that's how I got into university at Leicester. I went to Leicester still not quite certain about the educational system. But I stayed at Leicester from 1961 till 1964. And I got an honours degree in botany. Went back to London, couldn't get a job. The labour exchange, when I went, the guy smiled at me and said, "What can you do?" And I said, "I've got a degree." And he turned to his friend and he said, "I think he's got a temperature." You know, degree, temperature. So anyway, he gave me 2 jobs, one in a betting shop and the other one to peel potatoes. So I took the potato peeling job. And I peeled potatoes from June till December in 1964. And I had the famous interview with the famous politician who told me I should go home and grow bananas when I wanted to do a master's. But I did point out to him that it's difficult to grow bananas in Haringey. I didn't get the job, but I told him, the message was, I'm here to stay because this is my history. This is part of my heritage, being in Britain. And that's where my work started, on the history of Jamaica and Britain and Scotland. Because when he told me that, I thought this was the mother country. That's what we were told in Jamaica, you know, in school or in church. And here I was being told I should go home and grow bananas. So anyway, that failed. But I had an interview in Edinburgh for a job where Professor Anna MacLeod, she told me she's from the Isle of Lewis, and she was very tough. You know, she wore tweed and smoked senior service cigarettes, packets of 50. And she was the professor at the Heriot Watt in the brewing. And she wanted a PhD student to work on barley. And that's how I started my career, really, with barley and malt and brewing and distilling. Because in 1964, she gave me the chance, where this great politician didn't. And I remember the interview, and she has sadly passed away as well. But when she interviewed me, it's a classic story where she was telling me about barley and malt, and I've never heard of barley and malt. I did a botany degree, but cereals were regarded as man-made. So you didn't teach them in an honors botany degree, which was just silly. The point is that she was telling me about barley and malt, and I've never heard of it, and about the distilling and brewing and things like that. And I just switched off. So about 10 minutes into the interview, she stopped and she said, "I'm going to take you." And I said, "Why?" I said, "I have no idea what you're talking about." And she said, "There's a very good point in your favor, young man." And I said, "Well, what is that?" She said, "When I was telling you about the industry and barley and malt, you were looking out the window." And she said, "That's a very good point in your favor, because I hate keen people." And she also said, "And it means you won't bother me." But that was Anna. But what she did was she checked my background. She checked the difficulties I had. And she made a decision, which in terms of a concept which I've used, is about wider access. How do you do it? And you do it not by the person's degree or what they look like. You do it by checking their background and their degrees of difficulty, which they've had. And Anna MacLeod did that. And therefore, that brought me to Scotland. That's how I came to Scotland in 1964, December. I started my PhD in January 1965 on barley. And I finished my PhD in 1967. So I started in 65, I finished in 67. The Heriot Watt couldn't give PhDs then, so my PhD is really from Edinburgh, the Edinburgh University. After my 3 years with her, I stayed for an extra year doing a postdoc. So after I finished my PhD, I went and worked for the brewers and the brewers in Surrey. The brewers then had a big research establishment, probably the only independent research establishment in the country, supported by Scottish brewers and English brewers and Welsh brewers. And my job was barley and malt research. I'd become a bit of an expert because of my PhD. I started to change all the concepts about how you change barley into malt with my PhD. For example, I decided that when the grain is changed into malt, it is the bran that digests the grain and changes it into malt. The bran, not the germ, as people have believed for 200 years. So changing the concept got me a little bit noticed. And then I went back, as I said, to the Research Foundation, and I developed my research there. And I'm well known for a process called barley abrasion. If you just type in 2 words, barley abrasion, I use the scientific concepts from the area of art for my PhD and developed a process called barley abrasion, which in 1970s, most of the brewers were making their malt with that process. So I left and came back to Edinburgh in 1977. So I left in 68, came back to Scotland in 77. And I'm sitting in the same house, which my wife and I bought in 1977 for not a large amount of money. And when I came in, my neighbor up the road, his daughter told me, my dad says, our house prices are going to go down because I've moved in. I still know him now, he says, you know, Geoff, the house price will go up because you're here. Because I told him, you're a knight of the realm. He'd forgotten in 1977, it was the reverse. But anyway, I came back to Scotland and I, fortunately, for me then, Anna MacLeod retired in 1977 and I got her a position as a lecturer. And I started to teach. And my link now with Glasgow as such started it's about the 1990s. I got a strange phone call from a gentleman called Murray Blair. And he sort of said, are you Geoff Palmer? I said, yeah. He said, can I come and have a word with you? And this was in the 1990s, early 1990s. And he said, and I said, well, are you a brewer or a distiller? He said, no, I'm a member of the Maltman. Well, I'd never heard of the Maltman. And so he came over to Edinburgh and we had a chat and he said, he belongs to this organization and he would like me to join. And I said, well, what do I have to do? Does it involve research? And he said, well, not quite. And, you know, we had this discussion and he came over about 2 or 3 times to Edinburgh. I think he linked it to his job. I don't know what his job was then, but whenever he came to Edinburgh, we met. And I decided to take him up on it. And I became a member of the Maltman. I joined. And I became a member of the Maltman, and he, I think that he was visitor. I think Murray at the time was visitor. And what the Maltman did then was wonderful. They set up a scholarship. You know, they asked me about you know, my work, and they set up a scholarship, the Maltman Scholarship, and it still exists today. And there's somebody is just trying to phone me, and believe it or not, that's my student who actually got the first Maltman Scholarship, Dr. Agu. And he was from Nigeria, and he's still in Edinburgh. And he always checks on me. And I told him I was giving a talk, and he was trying to probably get through. But anyway, the Maltman gave him a scholarship when there were conflicts in Nigeria, and he couldn't finish his PhD. And he received a scholarship from the Maltman, and that allowed him to finish his PhD. And he is still working at the Scotch Whisky Association now. So that scholarship, he told me that he got it in about 1998. So that was my link that brought me to Glasgow. Now, when I came and joined the Maltman, I used to come into the trades, you know, the trades hall. And I was wondering, this building seems extremely exotic. And I used to, when I left meetings, go walking down Jamaica Street because I was fascinated by this street in the middle of Glasgow, which was called Jamaica Street. And I used to walk down to the river, to the Clyde. And then I started to check about Jamaica Street. What's its history? Why is it called Jamaica Street? And I started looking, and I found that Jamaica Street was opened in 1763. Jamaica Street is one of the oldest commercial streets in Glasgow. It's older than George Square. I think George Square is 1787. So Jamaica Street is there because of the links with slavery. So Jamaica Street was built in order to probably start trading in sugar, rum, and of course, coffee. People tend to forget that Glasgow was one of the most important coffee cities in Europe. And that coffee came from Jamaica. Very famous, it's the Blue Mountain coffee, which I tell people is the best in the world. But Glasgow was an important coffee destination from Jamaica. Now, when you look at Glasgow as such in terms of that commerce, then you look at other aspects of Glasgow and its links with the Caribbean. You have two men in Glasgow who are strongly linked with Jamaica. And one of them is James Ewing, and the other one is James Buchanan. Now, James Buchanan is linked to the famous Buchanan family. And, George Buchanan in the, 1600s was in fact a maltman. So one of the Buchanans initially, they were into malt as their business. And of course, the family then changed to tobacco, and from tobacco to sugar, as things change in America. So we have then that link between malt, tobacco, sugar. Now, James Buchanan was in Jamaica, in Kingston, and he was an agent. You have slave owners, but one of the most important aspects in slavery were agents, because they did the buying and the selling, clothes, the materials once they were produced. They also, the clothes, the slaves had to wear clothes, so they bought linen, which came from Scotland. And thus, Buchanan himself never owned slaves, but he was an agent. So he was involved in the buying and selling of the materials that kept slavery going. Now, he came back to Scotland. And of course, when I came to the Trades Hall, I looked upon one of the boards one day and I saw his name. And he had given the Trades Hall about £10,000. And that was for educational purposes. And I know, because I've spoken to various people in the Trades Hall and or the Deacon Convener of the past. And, I'm aware that 10,000 was to help poor children in order to get like an industrial education. And that has been done, and I'm sure that has continued. The James Ewing's name is also on the board, although a lot of people don't realize that. And he had slaves in Jamaica. He had slave plantation in a place called Caymanas in Jamaica. And the family still owns, I'm told, section of that plantation. So much so that the High Commissioner of Jamaica once told me that he knew the Ewings in Jamaica. Of course, the Ewings are associated with the necropolis. James Ewing was the one who set out its construction, and I visited it. I even visited his grave there. So there's a link then between James Buchanan, and that's of the Buchanan Street family, and also with James Ewing and the necropolis. They all have links with Jamaica. Now, if we take a little bit of the indirect history of the Trades Hall. Now, the Trades Hall was built in about 1794. And that was during the time when my favorite person, who I'm doing a lot of research on at the moment, is Henry Dundas. 1794 is 2 years after Dundas stopped Wilberforce from abolishing the slave trade. 2 years. Dundas held up Wilberforce from 1792 to 1807, 15 years. And he held him up on one word: gradual. Dundas says the slave trade should be gradually abolished. And that caused about 630,000 Africans to be transported into slavery on the basis of one word. Now, what is interesting, it is during that period, 1792 to 1807, that the Trades Hall was built. Now, it is built on a very important history, which is linked to malt. It's a very important history that is linked to malt. Now, what happened, where the Trades Hall is at the moment, is it's built in the grounds of Shawfield Mansion. And Shawfield Mansion was a rather big house, I'm told, was on Glasford Street. Of course, Glasford Street wasn't there then, but it was in that area, Shawfield Mansion. And it was built in about 1711, early 1700. Shawfield Mansion was built by an MP, Daniel Campbell, very early 1700s. And that was his house. And of course, he lived there from 1711 until about 1725. It's a very important date in terms of malt, because there are 25 articles to the Union of 1707. There are 25 articles. Article 13 relates to the malt tax. And of course, the Scots refused to sign the malt tax in 1707. Signed all the others except Article 13, the malt tax. So in 1725, the people of Glasgow believed that Campbell, who built Shawfield Mansion, was responsible for the malt tax being passed. They blame him. So they burned Shawfield Mansion in 1725. It brought out the police, and some people got killed in that riot, because that's how important malt was to the economy of the ordinary man, because the people like Robert Burns sold malt, made and sold malt. He grew barley. So Burns knew a lot. Robert Burns knew a lot about barley and malt. If you read John Barleycorn, you will see that. It's one of the most accurate description of the malting process and using it to make whiskey. And, you know, so barley malt was critical to a lot of small people in industry. And so they burnt Daniel Campbell's house in about 1725. And he then got compensation because the government thought, it was because of his parliamentary action. And Campbell took that money and bought Isla, the island of Isla. And he then sold his house to MacDowell. And MacDowell bought the house, and MacDowell was a slave owner, was in slavery. So he was very rich. I think, and he bought that house in about after 1725, and he sold it in about 1760 to John Glassford. And John Glassford lived in that house until in about 1792. It was demolished. And that's how the Trades Hall came to be built, because Shawfield Mansion was demolished in 1792, and the Trades Hall was built in 1794. So therefore, that's the succession that has produced the Trades Hall and Glassford Street. And therefore, there is that link between Malt and myself and the Trades Hall and Jamaica Street. And therefore, you couldn't have imagined that relationship with the wee boy who was born in St. Elizabeth in Jamaica. And in fact, during my period, I was, of course, a member of the Maltmen, and I think I had the great honor of being visitor of the Maltmen. And therefore, to me, that was a great journey. It is, when I give other talks about slavery, it's usually about the details and all the politics that, were involved at that time. But what I've tried to do, this evening is to show a sort of a humanitarian link between just ordinary people, just moving from one part of the world to the other. And of course, my mother and I are part of the Windrush generation. So I've written on the Windrush generation because, of course, I'm a member. It was a time when, my mother was working like 6 days a week, and you don't get holidays because you work during the holidays in order to get 2 weeks extra pay. And, a lot of my relatives that work on the buses, the tubes, factories. There were loads of factories. I worked in them myself during the holiday. I was very good at making leather handbags for Fassbender and Evans. That's what I did during the holidays. So the Windrush generation, we not only worked during the 200 and odd years of slavery, but we also came in the 50s, 1948 onwards, to help the country to recover from the war. And of course, we have the unfortunate situations where, we were actually, people were deported. In fact, my mother was threatened with deportation. In fact, had I not gone to London on a visit and found a letter that she had and hadn't bothered to open, and I opened it and it was saying to her that if she did not become registered, I'm registered, she would be put out of the country. So I had quickly filled that form in. I myself, when I went to represent the country in 1971 in Portugal, so I was representing Britain, talking about barley and malt in Portugal. And when I came back, the young man at the airport looked at my passport, and my white colleagues went through from the industry, and I was held back. It was 1971. And he said, where did I where am I coming from? And I said, Portugal. I went to represent the country. And then my boss came back, and my boss said, you know, what's going on, Jeffrey? And I said, it won't let me in. And he said, it's ridiculous. You've just represented the country, etc. And it was that little argument I hadn't noticed that he had actually stamped in my passport, visitor for 3 months. So I just represented the country and I had stamped in my passport that I was visitor for 3 months. And because of my boss arguing for me, he struck it out. I still have the passport here. So what we have is that what I've tried to say tonight is a story which probably a lot of people haven't heard. That is the past, many of us who are descendants of that slavery in the past, which lots of people are talking about now. But that is the path which I was lucky. And what I would like to say, you know, people's lives should not be dependent on luck. You know, we need a system where, in fact, people can make progress without having to depend on only the goodwill of people. And it's the goodwill of people that has got me to where I am today. And what I would like to do now is to thank everybody who's you know, listened this evening. And I'd like to finish with a letter which I've just received from the Prime Minister of Jamaica. And I would conclude with this. I received this letter on the, it was written on the 7th of August. And what the Prime Minister of Jamaica says here is when I was made a Commander of Distinction of Jamaica. He says, "Dear Professor Palmer, it gives me great pleasure to inform you that acting on my advice, His Excellency the Governor General has conferred the honor of the Order of Distinction in the rank of Commander CD upon you for exceptional representation and service to the Jamaica diaspora in Scotland. Thank you very much."
So Geoff, it's Tom Monteith here. As luck would have it, just about 1 minute before you were finishing,
okay,
Tracy's link into this webinar seems to have disappeared.
oh,
I wonder, I know that Robert has more to say, but I wonder whether if anybody does have any questions for Sir Geoff, if they could use the chat function and send them through. And
I can see a question about James Ewing.
Yeah. Lots of questions coming in now. Do you want to pick them up, Geoff? Maybe just read you
could read them to me because they come up quickly and then disappear.
Perfect. Okay. So the first question, I think I'm right in saying that James Ewing owned plantations that had slaves, whereas
Yes.
James Buchanan was an agent.
Yes.
In your view, does that make Buchanan not as bad as Ewing, or are they equally culpable?
I think they're probably equally culpable because the agents were, you know, they were businessmen. They kept the business of slavery going. And James Ewing owned slaves. And I think that it was a business. So they both complementing each other.
Do you think that that Glasgow as a city is doing enough to acknowledge the role that it had or has played in the past in connection with the slave trade?
Well, yeah, I know that the city, the Glasgow City Council has actually engaged a young man called Stephen Mullen to take a serious look at Glasgow's links with slavery, because it's everywhere. If you've got Jamaica Street, as I say, which is very old, but you've got the Gallery of Modern Art, was a slave master's house. You've got Glasford Street. You've got the Oswalds, which I've not mentioned, but the young Oswald started in Glasgow as a young apprentice, and he goes off to Jamaica and he teams up with the Grants of Speyside, and they became absolutely wealthy by running Barnes Island like a slave supermarket. And he then marries Mary Ramsey, and Burns wrote a wonderful poem about Ode Sacred to the Memory of Mrs. Oswald of Auchengrove. And in it, it's probably the most powerful line of Avarice ever written. And Burns says, that there are a couple of lines. He says she was on an annuity of £10,000 a year. And then he said, she had hands that took, but never gave. Hands that took, but never gave. And I think there's a lot of areas, the Merchant City reflects that history. But the great thing about Glasgow is that, for example, Glasgow University has looked at its history, honestly. Glasgow University has decided they were going to look at their history. They did just that. They came up by saying they got about 200 million in legacies, and they asked me to advise them, and they produced a report, and they've now set up educational links with the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, and they've also set up small scholarships for Black children in UK. And therefore, I think that's how you respond. You don't keep making up stories or historians making up excuses. The Scottish people don't want anybody to make up an excuse for them. They can make their own reparations. And I think Glasgow University has done that. And it was a great honor for me to be in the university unveiling that plaque for the university, which says, this university benefited and this plaque is in memory of those who suffered. And I think that is now appreciated not only in the university, it is appreciated all over the UK where I go to lecture. They did the big thing, which is what good people do.
Hi, Sir Geoff. If I can just come in, apologies first, my internet dropped out as it does in opportune moments. But there are quite a few people asking if you could explain how you felt when you met up with your father again.
Oh yes, I've forgotten that. Well, what happened was I went to New York to represent Britain to give a talk on barley malt in New York. And I, because it's barley malt, you always start first of the brewing process. And I got up on the rostrum, and my lecture was being translated into various languages, so I had to stick to the script. And I just started to speak, and the back door of the hall opened, and everybody in it was white, Mr. Coors from the Coors Company, Budweiser, etc., are all sitting there, and I'm looking at my script, and the back door opened, and 3 of the biggest black guys I've ever seen walked in. And they walked straight through the conference hall, right up to the front, pushed the chairs around and sat down. And I'm reading my script and I'm looking and I'm thinking, who the devil are they? And then after my talk, they got up and walked out. So I then left the rostrum, went outside, and there were 3 of them standing there. And the one in the middle says, do you know who I am? And I said, yeah, you're my father. And what had happened, my mother, who's didn't see him again after he left when I was 8, she has relatives, my mum, in New York. So they knew where he was about. So when my mother knew I was going to give that talk, she told them, and they must have told him. And we met, and he then gave me a hug and took me around Harlem to show his friends. This is my son. And the point is that, you know, we then made that link, and we kept in touch until he passed away. You know, when he passed away, I went to New York and to the funeral, and a tie I gave him when I met him the first time, he was wearing it. So again, you know, we're talking about, this is the history of slavery. It isn't about just people making money. It is about a fracture in lives or families that is different.
Yeah.
And this is just part of it. And I just see it as part of the way we live. But my children, because of education and because of good relationship with people, and I've got on my wall up there where Byrne says, you know, goodness mitigates woe. And I really believe that. And I've had all that, but my three children, one lives in Glasgow, one lives in Edinburgh, and the other lives in London. And they've all done very well. They all went to universities and schools in Scotland. So that's why I'm working so hard, because I believe that education is the way to change bad attitudes. And that's the only way we can do it. There's no other way of doing that. And I think education works. You know, we're all one humanity. That's what I've learned. We're one humanity, nothing less.
That's great. Tom, if I could ask you, do we have any more questions from anyone?
We do. There's actually been quite a lot of questions. Maybe just give three more questions, Sir Geoff.
Yeah, no problem.
You know what
I've
they
got all
are.
evening.
We'll not burden you with any more.
No, I'm okay.
The first of the three is what your personal view is in terms of possibly renaming streets in Glasgow, and what should happen to certain statues. The second,
Yeah.
Do you want all three to start? Or?
Yeah, okay. I think that, you know, one of the things that has got me into all this difficulty of these Zoom talks is because I said at the beginning that statues and street names should not be taken down. They're part of our history. And if you remove the evidence, you remove the deed. And therefore, I feel that somebody like Henry Dundas, we shouldn't take his statue down. We should put on his statue what he did. And that should apply to, you know, any other slave owner. I thought it was a mistake in Bristol to take that statue down of Colston, because we took it down, or people took it down, and what has been the result? Nothing. The point is, it's emotion to say that should come down. And I made the point, my ancestors faced slave owners, so why can't I face a bit of metal? No, we should put plaques on them stating exactly what they did. And that has caused so much difficulty with, say, the present Viscount, the 10th Viscount Melville. And for that, he called me a brewer. The implication that I don't have the credibility to argue with historians. I did point out to him that Henry Dundas was impeached by Samuel Whitbread the brewer. No, statues should remain, street names should remain, but we should put up plaques stating what they represent.
And sort of the second of three questions related to that one is, do you feel that the teaching of history within Scottish schools should talk more about Scotland's, Glasgow's, Britain's role in the slave trade than it does?
Yeah, I think it should be in the curriculum. You know, the Scottish government has asked me to look at, to chair a galleries and museum committee, which they've set up, and I've agreed to do that. And I think what we're going to do is look at the galleries, look at our museums, and we're going to clarify the history, and we're going to communicate it to the public. And in this regard, I think Scotland, you know, we're ahead. I spoke to the English museums a few days ago, and they were talking about some aspect of Scottish history, which was in fact completely incorrect. And I think that we should do that because it not just applies to Scotland, it's about human behavior. And I think that, you know, because one was involved in it, it doesn't mean you've got to keep making excuses. So we must try and find the truth and put it in the curriculum so that we can change attitudes. And what is interesting, we need more representation so you don't get the silly situation of where I went to give a lecture in Edinburgh last year, and when I arrived, the young lady said, can I help? And I said, I've come to give a lecture. And she said, what time? And I said, 2 o'clock. And she said, no, you can't be giving a lecture at 2 o'clock because that lecture has been given by Professor Sir Geoff Palmer. And education will solve that. It's not that young lady's fault.
Thank you, Geoff. And one last question.
Okay.
Do you think your life would have been much different if your mother hadn't sent you that £86?
Yes, it would. I can tell you, I would still be in London, and I was lucky. And because there are other kids who are left in Jamaica who I grew up with, you know, have done nothing like what I've done. And therefore that £86 has given me a sense of belonging. It's where it just like my grand aunt wrapping me in newspaper. It is that somebody really is concerned about you. And that's what I say to people about the Scottish kids and whatever, that parents can give kids that sense of belonging, and they don't have to send them to private school. The kids know that their parents have done the best they can. And I think with that view, you can motivate kids. If you can give children that view that they are cared for, and even if it's a slice of bread every day, somehow that helps to motivate children. And that motivated me. And my dear old mother, as I said, whenever there was a row, whatever, but she was so proud when I was up here in Scotland. I was professor and she's in Haringey, and her neighbour in Haringey saying to her, Miss Ivy, how's your son in Scotland? And she said, he's doing all right, you know, he's still at school. So the Prime Minister of Jamaica is actually saying, and I'll read that again so we can end on that. The Prime Minister, Andrew Holmes, Prime Minister of Jamaica, actually says, the CD is not just for me, it's for everybody, but he says, it's for exceptional representation and service to the Jamaica diaspora in Scotland. So the Prime Minister of Jamaica knows what we're doing, and he approves. And for those reasons, you know, we can change anything. You know, we cannot change the past, but we can change the consequences of the past, such as racism, for the better. And this is exactly what we're doing up here in Scotland. And we're going to show the world that we can do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Geoff. If I could, if you don't mind, just ask the Deacon Convener, Ken Dalgleish, if he would like to say a few words on behalf of the House.
Thank you very much, Priestess Robert, and congratulations to you for taking up your post. And I'm sure you will serve the Grand Antiquity Society in the same way that as Deacon, you served the incorporation of Skinners back in 2013-14. I'll come back to the Grand Antiquity Society in a minute, but Sir Geoff, I'd like to thank you for that exceptionally heartfelt and honest lecture. And of course, Jamaica's loss is Scotland's gain. And the best £86 of value ever, I believe, based on what you told us. So your mother's £86 out of her pocket has been a huge investment for Scotland. And in this current climate, the comments that you made in relation to, particularly about slavery and Glasgow's connections, and of course you mentioned also the Dundas statue, and I know that the recent documentary which you appeared in was exceptionally well received, and we then learned at the young age of 80, you're still a good-looking presenter on BBC television, so well done with that. We hope that what you said actually, and you used the word humanity on 2 or 3 occasions, and I know that in a recent, you are a very prolific blogger and user of Twitter, and I noticed recently that you made a comment which really stuck with me: to remove the evidence is to remove the deed. And I'm picking up on comments made in the chat column of this lecture. And to just summarize, we know that we must acknowledge, reinterpret, and above all, educate, because it's education that's at the core of everything that you're saying. And we want to thank you for all of the words that you gave us tonight and the very humble way that you presented them. Just a final comment on some of the comments that you made. I too had a primary school teacher who smoked senior service, and I think she also smoked maybe 60 a day perhaps. And she sent me to the staff room one day to collect her handbag, and it was like a time bomb of nicotine. It was the most disgusting thing I ever experienced. So that put me off smoking ever. So I share your pain on that one. And also just to maybe touch on Trades House a bit. As you know, Trades House is closed at present. And to everyone who's on this webinar, I just want you to know that we are in good heart. There are still weddings going on. We have a really good booking schedule for weddings in 2021. And the weddings that we've had this year, we had one today actually, and it was a couple who eloped from London before the lockdown started in London. It's the most incredible story of looking over the internet and finding Trades House looked like a good place to go to, and they booked their wedding and they eloped to Scotland, and they're going on their honeymoon to Loch Lomond. So I wish them well. Could I also just say to you, Sir Geoff, that you are an incredible motivator at the age of 80, and your achievements are exceptional, and it is very much Scotland's gain that we have you in our midst, and I hope you will continue to pioneer on the education front, because increasingly that's what Trades House is focused on. And it's to be hoped that James Buchanan, when he made his hugely generous donation of £10,000, which of course in the 18th century was a huge amount of money, that there was maybe some form of clemency in what he was doing in his head, because he was directly investing in the children of the tradesmen at that time. But it was a great history lesson for us all. So thank you very much indeed. And I hope to meet up with you sometime soon for that coffee. That COVID has denied us being able to do that, Sir Geoff. Could I just also say thank you to Priestess Robert and to Tom Monteith for organising this webinar. It's a really good way to communicate, and we are using it more and more as we are completely unable to meet up as a group. So I hope everyone enjoyed and welcomed the lecture. And just going by the comments again, I'm sure everyone did. Priestess Robert, it's a great organisation, the Grand Antiquity Society. I know you have family connections there, and I wanted you to know that given the situation where it's third generation situation. I have just convinced my very young granddaughter and grandson that they should be looking to join. And what the Grand Antiques need to understand is that they're really important because they are a breeding ground of potential people to join in corporations down the line when they get involved with Trades House. So I'm going to make that as a selling point for the Grand Antiquity Society. But clearly the lecture series is going to be a huge success given the standard of presentation you had last year and again this year from Sir Geoff. So thank you again. And before I go, I'd like to just show everyone and demonstrate a possible Christmas present that you may all wish to buy, given the situation that we have with the virus and all the possible lockdowns. This is a face mask, which is designed as you would see any medical face mask, but it's the Trades House tartan, and I'm going to put it on. I promise to do this, so very quickly, I'll put it on and take it off again very quickly.
Oh, it's very smart.
Very smart. You look so much better.
Thank you very much. So that, yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that. That's an ideal stocking filler for Christmas. So if you want any, please get in touch with the office and they will tell you how to purchase it. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks again, Robert, for all your work.
Thank you, Deacon Convener, for that. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much for that, Deacon Convener. On behalf of myself, Geoff, and the directors of the Grand Antiquity Society, I would like to thank you very, very much for what has been a very insightful and, from your point of view, personal lecture tonight. The information has been fantastic, and I would like to show you what we are going to give you if we ever get a chance to meet you.
Okay.
This is a paper copy, but you will get the real copy.
Wow.
To commemorate your lecture. So once again, on behalf of the directors and myself, thank you so much for giving up your time, which is, I know, very valuable and precious time. And I wish you every success in your new venture working for the Scottish Government. It's opened my eyes up to a lot of things, and especially how difficult it must have been for your generation coming from Jamaica to this country. I had never realised how difficult it was. So thank you again.
And thank you for all the directions, and Tom for ensuring that I've got to the lecture on time. But thank you all. It's my life has been about people helping, and it seems to continue, and I love it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Switch off my phone.